Sony CEO sold $4.7 million in stock 2 days after killing physical games. Welcome back to Tanveer Talks, and I'm Tanveer. Today we're going to be talking about, Sony's decision to end physical disc productions. On July 1st, they literally confirmed it, right? Right, starting January 2028, every new PlayStation game will be digital only. Like, no more discs on store shelves. No more physical version of new releases, like, ever again. Like, that's huge, right? Anything released before that date stays exactly as it is, but, every game after January, 2028, like, exists only as a license tied to your account, basically. Like, let that sink in, and to put a number on it, right? Like, the 2027 holiday season is now the final Christmas for, the brand new physical PlayStation discs. Like, after that, it's just over. Like, Sony's, already repurposing its last disc factory out in Austria, to build, optical micro lenses instead. Right? That's how permanent this is. Like, they are not pausing the line. No, they're shutting it down completely. Like, Sony's official reason is simple, right? Digital downloads, now make up somewhere between 80 and 85% of your full game sales. And, Sid Schumann, a senior director at Sony, called it like a quote, a response to shifting trends, in consumer preference, basically. But here's the problem with that framing, right? Circana data shows, 82% of PS5 consoles sold, still have a disk drive in them, right? So the hardware people are buying, says one thing and Sony's decision says another. Like, think about it, right? For perspective, right? When the PS4, launched back in 2013, only 13% of the, full game sales were digital. 13%, by 2025, that number climbed to like almost 80. That's not a slow drift, right? That's a complete flip in like about a decade. So the trend is basically real, right? Nobody's disputing, that people are buying more digitally. The question is like whether Sony needed to remove the option entirely or whether, this is about something else. Like 2 days after that announcement by Sony, right, on July 3rd, the Sony CEO, Hiroki Toroki, right, sold 225,000 shares. 225,000, right? That's $4.7 million, at just over, $21 a share. Like he's not alone, right? Chief Strategy Officer Toshimoto Mitomo sold 25,000 shares that same day. $500,000, The Chief Digital Officer to Tsuyoshi Kodera, has sold like 68,500 shares across, two separate trades this year, right? The former chairman Kenichiro Yoshida sold 400,000 shares in the last 6 months. Roughly $9 million. Like, add it up, right? Over the past 6 months, basically Sony insiders have made 4 trades on the open market, right? 0 were buys, all 4 were sells, right? Like, I'm not saying, this proves anything illegal, right? Like, executives sell stock for plenty of normal reasons, right? But when the leadership is telling the public digital is the future and simultaneously, cashing out at the exact moment that story breaks, you're allowed to ask, like, questions, right? Like, why? Right? Here's what makes this the timing really interesting, right? Sony's stock actually popped 3.2% on the day of the announcement. But zoom out, and Sony's stock is still down roughly like 22% over the past year, sitting near a 52-week low. This one of the executives, selling because the company is riding high. It was just a one-day bounce on a stock that's been, basically struggling. Sony's next earning report lands, August 6th. And that was the first time we'll get like real numbers behind the digital transition story instead of just, the talking points, right? Like, ask yourself this, right? Like, if you truly believed your company's biggest, strategic bet was about to pay off, right? Would you be selling millions of dollars in shares 2 days later, right? I don't know, right? Maybe it's nothing. Like, insiders sell stock constantly for taxes, diversification, all kinds of boring reasons. But 4 sells and 0 buys like cluster right around the biggest announcement of the year. Like it's a pattern like worth watching, like honestly, right? And there's also details that makes this even bigger than it first looked. First I was thought, okay, this is something, this is normal, right? That 225,000 shares sale wasn't like a small trim for Totoki. According to SEC filing surfaced by Quiver Quantitative, that sale represented 56.5% of his holding in that class of stock, right? He sold over half his position. 2 days after the announcement, chairman Kinochiro Yoshida sold 400,000 shares that exact same day, July 3rd, right? Combined market beat Peg's total insider selling around $10.5 million in that window, basically. And here's this twist, right? While the CEO was selling over half his stake, right, Sony's board was spending hundreds of millions of yen buying its own stock back, basically under a 500 billion yen buyback program. Sony repurchased over 37 million shares by early July, right, including the 18 million shares in June alone, basically, right? So you've got the board aggressively buying and the CEO aggressively selling in the same stretch of weeks, which signals are you supposed to trust? To be fair, none of this has been confirmed as a pre-planned scheduled sale. The kind of automatic 10b5-1 plan executives like Nvidia's Jansen Huang use, right? It could still be a routine tax or estate planning, but the timing alone is like why this is getting attention, right? Here's the part Sony really wants you to sit with. Basically, when you buy a digital game, you don't own it. PlayStation's own terms of services says it plainly, right? You're buying a personal license for private use. That license is not transferable. Translation, you can't lend it, you can't sell it, you can't pass it down. With physical, you can literally do that. Even though it's still a license, but you can still, lend it or sell it if you want, right? And this isn't theoretical, right? Sony recently, pulled over 550 purchased movies and shows from people's library because licensing deals expired. No refunds, just gone. A legal study found that 83% of consumers think clicking buy now means they own something. Legally, technically, they don't. California's new law, AB 2426, is going to force digital sellers to clearly disclose that you're licensing content, not buying it. That law exists because companies have spent 20 years letting people believe otherwise, right? And think about what that actually means, technically long term, right? If your account ever gets banned or compromised, your entire library can disappear in an instant. There is no box on a shelf to fall back on, no disk to hand to a friend, just access, and access can always be revoked. And it's not just games, right? Game preservationists warn that even physical disks aren't a perfect safety net anymore, because most modern games need a day one patch just to even run properly, right? So if the servers hosting that patch ever go dark, the disk in your hand might not even boot the game the way you remember it, basically. On the exact same day Sony announced the end of physical disks, they dropped a second bombshell, which is PlayStation Store for PS3 and PS Vita is closing, completely, globally, by July 2027. These phase shutdowns start in select market this August. Full closure, follows worldwide next summer. But think about the timing, right? Sony spent the same week proving that digital storefronts can die while telling you digital is the safer future. One fan on the PlayStation, blog called it beyond, parody, right? Sony says the closure are about, outdated security, payment processing, standards on old hardware. Critics have, point out those stores already, run on a wallet only system, right? So no credit card processing required, right? The security exposure, excuse does not add up, right? Once those stores go dark, digital only titles and DLC from that era may be lost. permanently. No physical backup exists for the games that were never on the disc, right? Like here's the actual rollout. Phased closure began in like what, August 2026 in select markets including Mexico, Honduras, and Nicaragua. And later in 2026 it expands to more of like Latin America and the Middle East, right? And then by July 2027 it's like a complete global shutdown. No new purchases anywhere on either platform, right? That one silver lining, Sony says that you'll still be able to, re-download anything you've already bought for what they call, for the foreseeable future, right? Which, if you're honest, is not exactly a guarantee. The community response has been brutal, right? And fast, basically. The announcement post on, the PlayStation blog pulled over like what, 8,500 comments. The overwhelming majority were like negative comments, like people did not like it. And one user wrote they were done with PlayStation after 30 years and thousands of dollars spent, right? Even brands outside gaming, piled on. Domino's Pizza publicly trolled Sony on social media over the decision, basically. And, when a pizza company is, dunking on your console strategy, that should tell you something about, how badly, this landed publicly. They thought they could, because Xbox did the same, and they thought it was perfect time. And independent developer, Eternium Game Studios also put out a statement, saying, quote, like, we will not let go of your hand, right? Pledging to keep making physical edition right up until the deadline, right? And independent publisher like, Limited Run Games and I Am 8-Bit came out swinging, wanting to, keep making physical editions as long as they possibly can, right? The phrase circulating everywhere, right now is you will own nothing and you will be happy, right? And Sony's response to all of it is nothing, like business as usual. Their blog kept posting weekly download charts like nothing happened, right? Some fans are calling it that, strategy, the PR bunker, like wait it out, basically. Let the algorithm, bury the outrage, basically. That's what they want. They want to wait it out, and not everyone, reacted the same way though, right? Frank Cifaldi, director of the Video Game History Foundation, called like unfortunate news for consumer rights. It is, right? And he also said something interesting, like for professional preservationists, this doesn't change as much as you'd think, because the real fight has always been about the legal process, not just, the physical discs. And, that's a more nuanced take than most of the internet is giving this story right now, I'm going to say. And even, developers, who've been, PlayStation's, I'll say like biggest allies, right? Like are uneasy with this, like Hideo Kojima, little Kojima, the mind behind Metal Gear Solid and that Death Stranding, said over the weekend, the decision made him like, quote, like really sad, right? And he basically, pointed out something important, right? A download game still lives on your hard drive, but if gaming ever shifts towards streaming the way movies did, you won't even have that. You'll just have a tab you're allowed to turn on as long as the server on the other end keeps running, right? And when Hideo Kojima is the one raising alarm bells about ownership, that's not just, internet noise, right? That's someone who spent decades inside the industry, right? So now let's talk about what's actually been happening on X, because there's a lot, like people, the story has been gotten bigger and bigger, right, since the announcement, because it's really messy, man, right? After the announcement, Sony and PlayStation official accounts went completely silent. 4 days, then 6 days, right? No statement, no follow-up, nothing. Still, while I'm posting this, there's nothing, right? When Sony finally posted again, it was a response to the controversy. It was a tweet teasing a Spider-Man movie with a single spider emoji. That post pulled over 8,000 replies on like 10,000 likes. Read that ratio again, like almost as many angry replies as likes. 6.3 million views total. Almost none of it was about Spider-Man. The PlayStation's account broke its own silence after 6 full days and picked the worst possible thing to post. A promo video for a new wireless fight stick called the Flex Strike. Like within 1 hour, that post had over like 2 million impressions and roughly 24,000 comments. And almost none of them were about the fight stick. One fan summed up the mood basically, right, perfectly, like saying, no way, this is the first tweet PlayStation puts out after 6 days. Like another one joked, like, is it a physical product? How do I download it? Right? Meanwhile, a fan petition demanding, Sony reverse the decision has already crossed what, like 170,000 signatures while I'm recording this, might be more by now, right? And like honestly, like other brand, like could not resist filing on it. Like Domino's Pizza posted that they'd be, ceasing production of physical pizzas and shifting to digital only pizzas. Right? They'll give the pizza code and they'll you enjoy it there. Esports Award joke that they stopped making physical trophies, offering winners a downloadable JPEG instead so they can have it, right? Even the gaming chair company, Respawn, got in on it, like announcing fake plans with digital only chairs delivered by download code. And retro console company Evercade, dug up Sony's own 2013 ad mocking Microsoft for restricting game sharing, right? And quietly pointed out how that ad has aged in the worst possible way. This has stopped being just a gaming story. It's become one of the biggest corporate social media pylons of the year. Before you point fingers only at Sony, look at what Microsoft and Nintendo are doing. Like Microsoft next console, reportedly like codenamed Project Helix, is being built from like the ground up with no disk drive at all. Like there's not gonna be a disk. They're also testing a program called Xbox Positron, letting you scan a physical disk to unlock a digital license, but that license stays tied to the disk. Sell it, you lose the digital copy too, right? Nintendo looks different on the surface. Physical sales actually grew slightly this year thanks to the Switch 2 launch. But analysts call that a temporary blip, not a reverse. So basically, Nintendo's, already testing the waters with, game key cards, basically, physical boxes on store shelves that contain nothing but a download code. I don't know what the future is gonna be like. I don't want to like a download code with my physical copy. PC gaming went through this like exact transition years ago, and it's now almost entirely digital, right? Every platform holder is heading, towards the same diskless future. Sony's just the one that put a hard date on it, right? Otherwise, everyone would be like jumping the gun. Microsoft did it like way back, right? And since Sony is doing it now, I think Microsoft is not gonna jump it. But the difference is like the approach basically. Microsoft is trying to, build a bridge for collectors with Positron. Nintendo is easing people in with the hybrid product on store shelves. Sony didn't build any bridge like that. They just announced that, deadline and let you deal with it. Right? And there's actually a real, I'm gonna say, irony buried in the gaming history here because right, back in 2013 Microsoft tried to restrict game sharing on the original Xbox One, and the backlash was so intense they reversed course before launch, right? And Sony, as like I talked, they actually mocked them for it at the time, and with the now legendary video showing executives simply handing a disk to each other to demonstrate how easy game sharing should be, right? And here we are 12 years later, Sony is the one walking away from that exact promise. There's no disk. GTA 6 launches digital only this November as well. Like that's going to be the industry's first real stress test for a release this year. Like it's massive. There's going to be no physical option. It's all download. How that split lands between digital sales and physical codes will probably decide, how fast the rest of the industry follows Sony's lead, right? And analysts already say this decision guarantees that the PS6 won't arrive before 2028, and it likely ships without a disk drive at all, right? And there's also a wider context here, right? Sony's been dealing with an ongoing memory chip crisis that's hurt their margin across the whole electronics business. The digital only future means fewer manufacturing costs, no shipping, no warehousing, no retail middleman taking a cut. And it also means no used games market, no trade-ins, no clearance racks undercutting a new release 6 months later. For Sony's, bottom line, this is like close to a perfect outcome. For your wallet, it's the opposite, right? So here's my honest take. Like, this isn't about really about convenience, right? If it was purely about convenience, Sony wouldn't need to remove the physical option at all. People who want digital would just keep buying digital, and people who want disc will just keep buying disc, right? Removing the choice only makes sense if the real goal is control over pricing, control over resale, control over how long a game stays available, and whose turns. And if you're a collector, this is probably like the moment think seriously about which games you still want physical copies of before January 2028 hits, right? And if you're someone who's fine going fully digital, that's a valid choice too. Just go in with your eyes open about what you're actually paying for. I honestly buy digital most of the times, but I do like the option, right? I like to have option to buy physical, but either way, man, right? Like, the era where you had a real choice between owning a game and licensing one is like closing fast, right? January 2028 just put a countdown clock on it, basically. So drop your take in the comments. You're like, are you team physical, team digital, or somewhere in between? I actually want to know before I record the follow-up on this. And if this is the kind of breakdown is useful to you, right? Subscribe so you don't have to miss the next one. Drop a like and share with someone who's still holding on to their disc collections, right? And if you want another example of a company badly misreading what its own audience actually wants, go back and watch my Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow review from last episode. So this is Tanveer Talks. See you on the next episode. Peace.